Delighted to see so many people here after this gloriously beautiful day and with only 2 weeks to final reviews, so thank you for coming to the lecture. Gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Ross Exo Adams as this year's Miriam Belazug Memorial Lecturer. The endowment supporting this annual lecture was created in memory of Miriam Belazug, who was a member of the Master of Architecture class of 1991. She died in the crash of TWA, Flight 800 in 1996. And the architect Peter Marino, who Miriam was working for when she died, along with many of her classmates, contributed to the funding that supports this annual lecture. Miriam was an editor of Perspective 30, and the speakers in this series are always chosen by Perspective editors from the upcoming or most recent issue. Previous Belazug lecturers include Kenneth Frampton, Mitch McEwen, and Felicity Scott, among many others dating back to the late 90s. Ross Adams is a professor of architectural studies at Bard College. He is an architect, urban theorist, and historian. He received his Bachelor of Science from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, his Master of Architecture from the Berlage Institute in Rotterdam, and his PhD from the London Consortium. Before joining the faculty at Bard, he taught at the Bartlett, at University College London, the Architectural Association, and the University of Brighton. Ross's work has been published widely, including in Radical Philosophy, Log, Society and Space, Environment and Planning, the Avery Review, and Efflux. His book, Circulation and Urbanization, was published in 2018 as part of the Society and Space series published by Sage Publishing. Now, the editors of Perspective 55, who chose Professor Adams as their speaker, Perspective 55 Futures Index, are Matthew Wagstaff, Lainey Barry, Jeffrey Liu, Nicholas Miller, and Ethan Zison, who I think is with us tonight. Perspective 55 was designed by Kayla Arsajaya, sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, and Julia Schaefer, who received their MFAs in graphic design from Yale in 2020, and speaks to the long history of Perspective's collaboration between the School of Art and the School of Architecture. So please join me in welcoming Ross Exo Adams for his lecture, Colonial Remnants of the Urban Present. Ross.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and thank you to the editors of Perspective for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here with you and sharing my work. I was actually going to start with a brief land acknowledgement, but actually I really appreciate the way you're doing them here with a map that was drawn in-house, as I understand. I think that's quite nice. I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement in part because I have an ambiguous relationship with land acknowledgements. When I give one, I'm inevitably speaking both as an individual, a white settler, and on behalf, voluntarily so, of whatever institution may be hosting me. Institutions that more likely than not have had a direct role in the violence of settler colonialism. So the question of whitewashing, of course, is never far away, but also my ambiguity comes from the fact that I feel they pay the tribute that they pay often tends to speak to a past violence that doesn't somehow acknowledge the ongoing nature of the violence in the present. And while land acknowledgements increasingly make nods to questions of structural and systemic forms of violence, what they don't often acknowledge is what it fully means to be occupying unceded land now in the present. It means that while colonization here in the US may have officially ended, though not that long ago, 1946 with the Philippines, and of course with the caveat of Puerto Rico, its colonial legacy does not simply go away, just as the original inhabitants of Turtle Island, the Caribbean, Hawaii, as well as present-day Central and South America, are very much present today, resisting the same kinds of physical, social, and environmental violence and dispossession they have since 1492. In other words, the fact that most of us may have normalized living on stolen land cannot in itself negate the ongoing struggles of indigenous communities and land and water defenders who continue to fight the occupying settler regime. Nor does it negate that we're living in a space shaped entirely by colonization itself, which, from a certain perspective, continues to be governed by a settler colonial regime. The fact that we have for so long narrated the attempted genocide of Native American nations and tribes and the subsequent settling of this country as historical events is, for me, a kind of epistemological sleight of hand that continues the work of settler colonialism in covering over these ongoing struggles, while also remaining ignorant to a certain ongoing inherited colonial disposition found in the institutions of this country and many others. And actually, I just found this literally the other day on Instagram, and I thought it was quite telling somehow, or interesting. What I want to do tonight is to dwell on this largely unacknowledged inheritance of a certain colonial logic that operates across space, class, race, gender, and the environment. A certain logic which shapes institutions, policies, ways of being and knowing. This coloniality, as people refer to it, far from being limited to settler colonial states, is increasingly something on display in both the compounded, interrelated crises we face today around the world, from seemingly insatiable stretch of urbanization across the whose effects are being felt in the breakdown of ecosystems, the loss of biodiversity, and the destruction of the natural world, to the border geographies and carceral landscapes that have emerged in response to displaced peoples forced to migrate around the world as a result, to the weaponization of debt as a tool to maintain the global divisions of labor that colonialism initiated, and the larger partitions that separate geographies of consumption from those of extraction, production, and sacrifice zones, and so on. The list could, of course, go on. While these examples may stand as what we might call problems, we also see the same logics at work in many of our solutions to the crises that we face. If the narration of a given crisis tends to also double as a kind of map of its resolution, climate change is an interesting study, especially in the centers of global power, where fields of design have been busy at work, devising and also exporting solutions to the impending effects of climate change on cities. So take, for example, resilience. Typically formulated as a capacity for a city or neighborhood or region to survive, adapt, and grow in the face of any major shock, resilience has become a paradigm that brings together the design of space with the making of policies and techniques for governing life in the age of climate change. Mirroring the move away from mitigation strategies that underpinned the rise of sustainable architecture and urbanism at the turn of the century, resilience follows a broader shift towards adaptation taken up by many of the wealthy nations. Its origins as a design program draw from C.S. Holling's work in ecology in the 1970s, and many of you may know about this already, so forgive me if this is old news, but this work looked really to challenge existing notions of ecological stability in the face of a given shock. So in simple terms, resilience for Holling shifted the focus from stability, measured typically in population count of a given species, to the ecological relationships that exist between dependent species and their environment, which he dubbed as resilience. So effectively, ecologists would study, let's say, a species of something, some animal or whatever, in the face of a shock and sort of see how much the population diverges and returns back to that sort of normal state. And Holling thought that that was an inadequate way of understanding ecological systems. So what he was wanting to see was actually looking, sort of zooming out and seeing over a longer time span how populations respond to a given event. And what he found is that, in fact, there are certain cases where if you just measure population count, you're actually not measuring this kind of idea of stability, where basically, let's say, a kind of insect that fed on some kind of tree, let's say a leaf or something, would go in through these huge swings in population. They would, multiply like crazy and eat all the forest, and then, of course, die out because they lack their food source. What he was saying is actually, if that would be seen through a traditional lens as an unstable system, what he was wanting to shift to was a longer-term sort of view on that, which actually showed a certain kind of stability over time, and this is what he called resilience. So resilience for him was really about the relationships between the systems at play, not looking at population. And I think, in a sense, it's not a matter of, of what animals or species live and die. It's really a matter of the sort of the kind of systems at play and the stability of the systems that he wanted to focus on. So, as applied to design, however, I think we might be forgiven for equating resilience with stability, right? That these things seem actually not to be, there doesn't seem to be this kind of resilience as he talks about it. Its projects all seem to play up to the kind of thriving of communities and their ensured survival in the face of of ever worsening weather. Yet a closer reading of these projects often shows another story, one in which there's much more alignment with Holling's work, less the kind of well-intended use of design to protect the populations of city dwellers from the effects of climate change. Its proposals actually show resilience to be a mode of planning aimed to protect the viability of present-day systems in the face of climatic breakdown. So infrastructures, governance, circulation, but also real estate, finance, capitalism, growth, empire. Resilience, we could say, is a coordinated effort not to preserve people per se, but to preserve a certain world. And the nature of this world can be seen in part in its proposals. It posits climate change is a problem whose solution is largely technological, whose effects are measurable on a timescale of real estate investment, whose ideas of nature, still somehow apart from us, somehow separate from us, is a tool, a kind of infrastructure in itself, something to be appropriated, designed, and deployed against its own uncontrollable effects, right? Nature against itself. Its promises to refashion urban space for an increasingly erratic, violent, and unknowable climate all add up to a kind of nearsighted plea, not for a different world from which to forge new relations with nature, with non-humans, with ourselves, with the cosmos, but really for an augmented urban world, something like a short-term time capsule in which we may indulge in a romantic perpetuation of our present world of consumerism, real estate, leisure, the family, private property, and so on. As I've argued elsewhere, resilience in a capitalist world will never be for everyone. So as persuasive as these projects may have been for many, and as much as their images and proposals embrace a kind of language of liberal inclusivity, they do little, I think, to confront the morbid world of climate apartheid that always manages to slip outside the frame of their images of perpetual summers and placid urban natures. Just as the vast urban spaces of this world will inevitably be left far outside of the reach of any resilience proposal. So it's important, I think, to look critically at these proposals, as with anything. But if we see the mainstream design world's response to climate change as a window into a broader set of processes at play beyond the design world, what I think the larger resilience turn, and it is much more, it's obviously exists outside of the world of design, it cuts across all sorts of different disciplines and fields and so on. What I think this larger resilience turn shows us is an increasingly desperate effort by the institutions of our world to shore themselves up against multiple compounding crises that threaten their viability. It's a picture of a response to a certain world ending. But as much as we're told otherwise, climate change is not an isolated crisis, nor is it a threat multiplier, as a lot of people in the resilience world like to reduce it to, nor is it a crisis to come. Climate change is, in my mind, the face of a much older crisis, the expression of this particular world that has for so long represented itself as the only world. To use Elizabeth Pavanelli's term, climate change is an ancestral catastrophe, a world ending that is heir to countless other worlds ended. And thus, as more and more of us are seeing, our solutions to climate change look a lot more like capitalism saving itself from itself, forms of governance adopting themselves ever more callously to preserve power amidst the crises of their own making. And I think resilience, as taken up by the mainstream of the design world, is in a sense not different from this. So I think it's important to have a sober conversation about the world being sought to preserve, as well as those worlds its preservation would make impossible or even imperceptible. As I've argued elsewhere, what I think is at stake in contemporary urbanism, urban design, landscape architecture, and planning today is not the protection of any neighborhood or city, but really the preservation of the urban. A system of systems, a kind of space process that exceeds any singular city and that forms the spatial substrate of our present-day capitalist world. So what is the urban? It's a question I've been sort of pondering for a while now. And this is really where I want to focus tonight's talk, because I'm convinced that coming to grips with the urban is key to addressing some of the most pressing concerns we face today, as well as the historical injustices at their root. So what is the urban is, of course, a question that many geographers and sociologists have long been attempting to answer, beginning really with the Chicago School of Urban Sociology almost a century ago. Their work approached the city as an environment that shapes certain sociological patterns. And so they set out to kind of abstract observed tendencies that they found and processes happening in the city into spatial models that could then be used to describe a more general set of emerging conditions of urbanization in the early 20th century. So this model of research, groundbreaking as it was at the time, set a precedent, offering new ways to kind of see urbanization. If this was demonstrated in this kind of metropolitan model of Chicago's urbanization, it wasn't long until new kind of other figures like this sort of regional nebula of the northeast seaboard's megalopolis, as Jean Gottman called it, became visible, mapping unseen scales, spaces, and processes at work in reshaping the landscape, not so much in cities, but really between them. Only decades later, the bizarrely inverted exopolis of Los Angeles then made itself known as a kind of polycentric form of urbanization that develops in its suburban periphery, a sort of post-metropolis, as Ed Soja called it, referring, of course, to the Chicago model. All of which then opened the way for more recent work to capture the spaces and infrastructures that lie outside of the city altogether as equally urban. The city, as we now understand it through planetary urbanization theory, is really only one kind of concentrated part of a far larger urban system as described by this theory. And I'm sure most of you are probably well aware of this stuff, so I won't go into it, but effectively the argument is that the entire planet and even beyond has now become urbanized, which is, of course, a compelling argument and has all sorts of epistemological implications about what the urban is. Urban geographers and sociologists have long been aware of the dangers in generalizing observed conditions, so they've often relied on a parallel general form to sort of do the dirty work for them, namely capitalism. And for good reason. With the Chicago School, there was a certain Darwinian environmental determinism that really underwrote their work. So with the publication of Henri Lefebvre's texts, The Right to the City, The Urban Revolution, and most especially The Production of Space, which was originally published in French in 1974, the field was effectively turned on its head on the premise that space not only shapes society, as had been assumed, but that first and foremost, social relations produce space, right? So social relations of capitalism produce space. So this kind of Darwinian linearity was forced out, and in its place was a new kind of Marxist dialectics to understand these processes. Lefebvre's, of course, influence on many fields hardly needs any reminding, but his work here really opened the way for some of the most important thinking on contemporary urbanization, from David Harvey to Ed Soja, as I mentioned, Neil Smith, Raquel Rolnick, Eric Swingadow, Ananya Roy, Deborah Cohen, Neil Brenner, and so many more people. If the urban was a site of a dialectical relationship between the social and the spatial, mediated by capitalism, a whole new understanding of the city could be forged that understands power, justice, labor, dispossession, governance, circulation, and extraction, political ecology, and so many other things. All as a kind of function of capital that requires and thus produces specific configurations of culture and cultures of space. This is the argument, basically, or the foundation on which all this stuff is being produced. Yet by taking capital to be the overwhelming figure driving this narrative, the spaces of urbanization began to show a somewhat passive sensibility. If capital is the dominant, globally generalized social relation of modernity, it is so by shaping particular worlds according to its needs. Spatial order, the urban if you want, then can be seen as a kind of milieu, something that is absolutely essential for capitalism to reproduce itself, but also completely under its sway. This may explain why, as much as urban geographers are focused on describing the urban in its present, kind of emergent forms, they're less able to speak of the urban itself, and even, I would argue, Lefebvre, who wrote the book The Urban Revolution. Thus, a tendency in urban geography is to read space as a sort of ledger of capitalism's perpetual changes. Because of the ever-expanding, ever-variegated nature of capitalism, the lure of the present in urban geography, of course, makes sense. Yet for this reason, for as much as urban geographers have given to the world with their rich knowledge of contemporary urbanization, in my mind, I think they remain kind of fuzzy on the very object of study itself, namely the urban. All too often, I think we've treated the urban as somehow synonymous with the city, as the basis of human life, a kind of timeless category like many others, of human civilization, and so on. In the plethora of incredible research that looks to give new names, new processes found in the world, to recenter sites of urban studies outside of the city, to trace the urban as it expands across vast uninhabited swaths of the world, to reveal a planetary urban space, even this sweeping work tends to unwittingly conflate the technologies, infrastructures, and extractive assemblies it charts with the urban, sort of flattening it into a kind of spatial expression of capitalism. Right? And I don't wholly disagree with this assessment at all, but I feel convinced that these observations, when taken together, speak to something much larger at play, something that perhaps has gone unnoticed, because we can only somehow see the urban in its unfolding, in its urbanization. So what if the focus on the immediate present has somehow allowed us to overlook that what might be truly new in a kind of world historical sense is the urban itself? This is somehow a question that's been driving my thought for quite a while now. Jumped ahead, sorry. So what is the urban? Well, it seems to me that we don't yet have adequate language with which to encounter the urban otherwise. Despite our vast urban histories, I think we don't have a means by which to imagine that the urban itself might constitute a historical problem or figure. Because it's taken to be ahistorical by most, it has thus far slipped out of sight, gone unnamed, untheorized, again, despite the copious theories that describe how it works, what happens in it, how it's organized, and so on. But because this is an epistemological question, naming and making legible something like the urban is at once an exercise in clarifying its historical genesis, bringing it out again from the timeless categories of human existence and tracing its emergence in the world around a whole host of articulations in which space and social practices wove themselves into fundamentally new and then reproducible configurations. To ask if the urban has a history of its own is a question that seeks other histories that reveal it to be a rather novel kind of space, not at all synonymous with the city. Histories which therefore may lend themselves to a more radical set of appraisals in the present when we face not only a cataclysmic environmental future, but one that reveals the urban in its planetary extents to be at the center of multiple interrelated crises. In the past, I've approached this problem with the help of 19th century Spanish engineer Ildefonso Cerda. Cerda, as many of you will know, is primarily known for his Eixample of Barcelona, the extension of Barcelona, a project that paradoxically obscured the vast majority of his work, which was really in the form of theoretical treatises and speculative propositions. Paradoxical, I say, because the Eixample was really just a kind of test case for his larger theory of urbanization. His written work, however, was far more ambitious. In it, Cerda sought to persuade his peers that he'd discovered not a new kind of city, but really a new system for the co-organization of life and infrastructure that would do away with the city altogether. That was really his goal. He wanted to get rid of the city. In its place, a sort of edgeless, centerless grid of fluid circulation and private property was meant to extend across the earth, accommodating a calculated distribution of population and services. The urbe, as he called this space, was not a city at all, but really a kind of spatial template on which to consecrate new relations between society and technology, nature and capital, governance and subjectivity, territory and private property, movement and security, life and labor and others. In its spatio-technical disposition, the urbe would at once displace the city, as Cerda boldly thought, and render the state and its oppressive politics redundant. This was Cerda's goal. But the remarkably unquestionable ways in which Cerda could describe the urbe as a sort of technology in which subjectivity and space were inseparably bound to one another speaks to the broader kind of cultural imaginary of an emergent liberal imperial capitalism of which Cerda was a part, and in which this kind of space had really started to become visible to him in the first place. So while Cerda's presumption to have discovered and invented, urbanization is both remarkable and easily dismissible, though he did coin the term, the volumes in which he describes this process and the order of space it produces, I believe, deserve a closer, more interpretive attention. What I think they capture in diagrammatic and technological clarity is not so much an invention as it is a careful documentation and description of a kind of space process, right? Something hybrid of that he observed really unfolding across the spaces and landscapes of North Atlantic world. And in this kind of documentation, if you will, he does an incredible job in describing a space that resonates with some of the most contemporary theories and observations of urban geography. So, of course, we can't wholly take Cerda at his word. Just as he's not the inventor of the urban is not also the product of 19th century modernism. But then 19th century modernism itself is not simply the product of 19th century Euro-American industry and ingenuity, but rather modernism is also a continuation, in different terms, of centuries of colonial violence and imperial subjugation whose accumulated wealth created the very conditions for modernism to exist in the first place. In a sense, Cerda's writings should not only speak as observations in his present day, but they must also be read, I think, as the elaboration of an inherited understanding of space and subjectivity that would have seemed natural for him, indisputable. His urbe, then, may be less a new kind of space, per se, than it was an inherited form, an inherited one from the peripheries of the past, one that by the 19th century had been brought perhaps to the brink of its generalization as he was observing in his world. If Cerda's writings lend the kind of coordinates from which a history of the urban may begin to be traced, where might this history take us? What historical figures can shed light on its emergence into the world, if indeed it has, as I'm arguing, emerged at one point? If the urban is a historically recent kind of space, a history of it would need to attend to novel articulations between a certain understanding of space and of subjectivity that took hold, and that have roughly somehow reproduced themselves until the present. So questions that drive my thinking come from, in a way, from the present backwards. So what prototypes of space, for example, emerged that enabled and helped clarify the formulations of property law? What spatial models offered a direct means to experience new understandings of nature, of time, of the movement through global networks of commodities, the regularization of wage labor, and systematized extraction? What new kinds of space helped solidify the birth of capitalism and provided the lived experience of new understandings of the human meant to naturalize it? What forms of human settlements emerged from the abstraction of lands and bodies as a calculus of production, consumption, and distribution? So, of course, there's no single point of origin to much of anything, but there are definitely moments when otherwise subtle articulations between practices, spaces, ideas, technologies, and events can become clarified. And for me, such a moment is the mid to late 17th century with the rise of English colonial power in the Caribbean and North America. The distinction from the century and a half of Spanish colonial rule, in distinction from that, what's unique about the rise of English colonial power is not only evident in its generation of new and slightly more sophisticated settlements, or really in the shift to a kind of more commercial mode of colonization that they initiated. For me, it's really the kind of co-production of legal, economic, and philosophical work that the English developed alongside new spatial structures of extraction, enclosure, property, and security that both drew from and influenced these ideas. So there was this kind of building of space and ideas that happened at the same time and fed off of one another. This, for me, is really what formed the basis of what I think is indeed a radically new kind of spatial production that offered a template that could be taken up and largely generalized under capitalism, itself a legacy of colonialism. So the example that has me convinced of this is Philadelphia, a settler colonial city designed, of course, by William Penn and Thomas Home in 1682. There are several things that set Philadelphia apart from other settler colonial projects. First, it was a project that was not tied up, again, many of you may know this story well, but so forgive me for repeating it, but it wasn't tied up with any singular interests from trading companies or bound to the political directives of the Crown. Pennsylvania, as you may know, had been given to Penn as a payment to cancel a debt. As such, he went on to colonize the province with a degree of autonomy and creativity, if you want, not seen in the 2 centuries prior of earlier European and Spanish, Portuguese colonization. Philadelphia also became the first major city in what would become the U.S. to be planned as a grid, designed with wide streets and ample, deep blocks of green, all planned against risk of fire and disease. So very, modern in certain sense. But more than a site of religious freedom, as it's well known to be, however, Philadelphia was for Penn an early capitalist venture in land speculation, a sort of new platform for individual private wealth accumulation through both typical and atypical means of extraction. Such an ambition was clear even before any plan had been drafted, with Penn diligently seeking to attract like-minded purchasers, trade societies, and other wealthy adventurers, as he referred to them, to come and settle there. The city's calibrated distribution of density across its length, as well as the over-planning for the future, it was only like halfway at first, and he insisted that it go all the way to the Schuylkill. The over-planning for future settlers created a paradigm in colonial planning of systematic growth, something that had remained much more ad hoc in prior colonial settlements. Much like a modern real estate developer, Penn counted the successes of the settlements' development by its growth, or as he described it, as improvement in property value and land value. Indeed, improvement as a term was a distinguishing feature of Penn's city. Penn's planning was influenced by the work of William Petty, an economist, and his Political Arithmetic, which was published a decade or so, or written a decade or so before Penn's Philadelphia designed. Specifically, it was Petty's ideology of improvement that Penn applied in Philadelphia. Petty's economic work developed partly, actually the majority, in his overseeing of Ireland's colonization, organized a kind of mathematics across space that purported to quantify wealth based on a kind of early labor theory of population, in which each person was conceived as an economic unit of productivity, while land then was given a kind of corresponding value of productivity through its assumed yield. So improvement became a kind of disciplinary lens to both analyze a space and also correct productivity over a given space. So if land and population could be abstracted in terms of productivity, it could be reasoned then that land not seen to be as productive, according to Petty's Political Arithmetic, could be then expropriated from those inhabiting it on the basis of its need to be improved. Also, the need of the person inhabiting it could also equally be improved. Taking Petty's understanding of improvement to be a single economic idea comprising multiple coordinated forms of wealth extraction, Penn's colony not only was it a space for real estate speculation, but it would also serve as a central hub within a network of commercial colonial trade connecting the production of plantations in the South and the Caribbean with London's markets. So for this reason, in planning Philadelphia, Penn also planned the large tract of lands surrounding it, which he called the Liberty Lands, to be enclosed and converted for agricultural production. Purchasers of plots, those adventurers coming to purchase plots in the city, were legally bound to invest in agricultural lands outside, in the Liberty Lands, proportionally allocating 500 acres of those lands for every 10 acres of land purchased in the city. In this way, the development of the settlement would be tied in, and you can see here, I don't know if you can see that, that's Philadelphia right there, a little rectangle. In this way, the development of the settlement would be tied up with the ownership and cultivation of agricultural land outside of and contiguous to the city. This set in motion a system in which the city's planning could be synchronized with that of the region, including the founding of other rural townships. And since productivity was the goal and improvement was its measure, Penn went into great detail, setting out ordinances, regulating the division, ownership, governance, and labor needed in the Liberty Lands to assure that no settler remained idle and that no lands lay fallow. He even created measures whereby settlers could be expelled if they shirked their agricultural responsibilities. Of course, the caveat being that the actual labor of maintaining fields was carried out almost exclusively by slaves owned by the settlers, so of course it comes back again to questions of property. The novelty of Penn and Home's scheme was in its deployment, I think, of a single transscalar grid which could incorporate the parceling out of agricultural, rural, and civic lands in a single, seamless, interdependent, and above all, calculated spatial system of managed wealth extraction. Its spatial order bound settler colonial subjectivity with economic productivity, all of which was modulated by the generalization of private property. And because private property included land and the bodies of slaves, this spatial system further entrenched emerging racialized and gendered ideas of the human as a kind of work machine, as Silvia Federici has described it. Philadelphia likely served as inspiration for John Locke's later work on property, as well as on his work on the Board of Trade overseeing Virginia, where he recommended many of the same ordinances that Penn made to increase productivity. Indeed, it's likely that Penn and Locke shared the same criticisms of Virginia's plantations and their apparent lack of productivity, just as they drew from the same doctrine of improvement to dispossess Native Americans of their lands. The violence of improvement that Petty first tested out in dispossessing and displacing thousands in Ireland would then be generalized by Locke in English colonial space and beyond, establishing at the same time a foundational matrix on which racialized hierarchies of the human could be made. As Brenna Bandar has written, this logic fused subjectivity with a racial regime of property ownership that would continue to underwrite modern and contemporary forms of property law well beyond settler colonial contexts. The articulation that Philadelphia made clear some 3.5 centuries ago between nature, property, race, and capital, while not the first to do so, was nevertheless an enduring one. Penn's work went on to influence other settler colonial technologies like Oglethorpe's Savannah and Jefferson's Land Ordinance of 1785, which, if you don't know, sort of went on to at least purport to lay out the individual states all the way down to the parcels of private property. This is a very intricate kind of multi-scalar grid system. But what I think Penn created, though, that is so consequential to our present urbanizing world is not a kind of innovative city per se, but what I like to think of as a sort of social technology, a multi-scalar template on which new socio-spatial articulations could consolidate around a nascent capitalism, along with a new understanding of the human meant to naturalize this world. An understanding of the human that was discovered in part in the process of colonization itself. If this is the case, we might think of the urban as a kind of normalization and generalization of settler colonial forms of production of space. the creation of a sort of social technology. In that sense, the making of the urban cannot be prized from the making and managing of settler colonial spaces, nor can it be understood as distinct from the creation of modern subjectivity and its racialized, gendered hierarchies, as well as its mechanistic understanding of nature as something that needs to be enclosed, controlled, improved, and so on. This is what I think makes the urban, in my mind, something in excess of the city that preceded it. If the urban is a social technology, it's necessary today to confront the mechanisms which work to continuously maintain and reproduce it as a sort of natural background of life, shrouding its analysis in a transhistorical pallor. Yet all one has to do is really to look at contemporary urban space to see that it's also a site of perpetual displacement through waves of classed, racialized gentrification, to see it as a mechanism for the racial regime of property that seems unstoppable, to see it as a platform for an emerging climate apartheid that we really cannot ignore. As much as we speak today about decolonizing, I think we must insist that this cannot be reduced to an exercise of liberal inclusion, but must remain one that recognizes the continuation of colonial apparatuses that, whether sublimated into liberal capitalism or in its nation state, have never been dismantled. Indeed, resilience, I think, names the coordinated survival of this liberal colonial capitalist world amidst the violence and destruction of it that it has brought upon itself. We see this coloniality in forms of resilience gentrification, that it's already caused in cities across the global north, or when exported to spaces in the global south, as geographer Kasia Poproczky has shown, through the kind of dispossession and displacement of rural communities that its programs have brought to parts of the world. The resilience complex, I think, does both material and epistemic work to make claims about the future, foreclosing it to a logic of capitalist-led modes of development, while obscuring the fact that this form of development itself will inevitably displace the violence of the climate crisis to other sites and upon other bodies. In all the worlds destroyed by colonialism, in all the cultures smashed and integrated into empire or expelled to its peripheries, commodified and exhausted in the ceaseless production of capital, what world has it authored? So just to finish up, I think that our moment really must be one for building other societies, other worlds. And we might begin by destroying the bind that we find between nature and property that was fused at the onset of the settler colonial world and that has really underpinned the ceaseless destitution of the bodies and of natures it is enclosed. If architecture is to be a part of this, I think it needs to radically open itself to the worlds beyond its professional boundaries and begin thinking more in terms of collective forms of life. Thank you so much.
Ross has kindly said he will take some questions, so I'm hoping there's somebody out there who wants to ask a question. There are microphones circulating, so raise your hand.
Thanks for the talk. I was curious if, in defining the urbe, as you do, you sort of get to the point where the city and the urbe become completely different entities. And I wonder if you see in the city what might be actually a site of resistance to all these forces. And I actually think of the very, very early cities, the medieval cities of Europe, as a site where serfdom and that system of governance broke apart.
I really like that. I think that's a great way of almost formulating a kind of project or trying to reclaim something. And I appreciate that because I also, as I'm critiquing what I call the urban it's not really, I hope I'm not coming across as like some anti-urban, like I hate the city or something like that. So I think that I really like that formula that you've made. To me, that seems like a way to define a project or a way of thinking otherwise. So Yeah, I guess historically, and I don't know that I have an answer to like, the urban eclipsed the city, and therefore, I wouldn't want to make some kind of monolithic narrative gesture like that, which my work might suggest. But I think it's important to see things as coexisting, like different kinds of space that overlap others, so I think the idea of seeing the city as a site to be reclaimed, as a kind of conceptual, spatial object, a communal object, maybe object's not the right word, a communal space makes a lot of sense. So thank you for that.
Anybody else? I see one way in the back.
Thank you for the talk. I think what was fascinating for me in you recounting some of this history is to see how we as humans have built these systems. And if we build them, we can therefore reconstruct them. Mm-hmm. And this might be a slightly, well, I guess a lot of what we need to deconstruct is capitalism itself. And how do we do that? Because that is the big one thing that is apparently something we cannot reconstruct.
Yeah, that's a good question. Part of my work, I think, has been driven by a desire to make something like urbanization less inevitable, right? I think we tend to, a lot of the narratives we have, like, for example, the urban age thing that Ricky Burdett and all these characters put together 10 years or so ago, a lot of the theories that are constantly showing the newness of the urban, the way it's changing, is strangely enough, give it a kind of like trans-historical, as I tried to argue, a sort of quality that also makes it feel like all we can do is maybe fine-tune it and it'll become slightly less, deleterious and so on. I think part of what I'm trying to show is that perhaps this space is like capitalism also is not that old, right? It's a few centuries, 4 or 5 centuries old at this point. And that alone, I think, should give us hope that it isn't necessarily a human problem, right? We talk about the Anthropocene, for example, this sort of human-created condition, which really gets a lot of people off the hook. It just seems like, well, it's in our genes to like really screw up the planet we're living on, and well, there we go. We can like recycle a little bit more and have some chickens in the backyard and, not worry about it too much. But I think all of that really, and actually this narrative of like individual, remediation and so forth is really one that's taken on by the oil industry and proffered by them. So for that alone, we should be suspicious. But I guess what I'm trying to do here, and I think what other people in different fields are also trying to do, is to show and break this kind of assumption that the world we live in is just the sort of extraction from time immemorial, like on a sort of teleology, that only goes in one direction, but that we can actually change things. We didn't always live with capitalism, really, for the vast majority of human history. We didn't have what I call the urban for the vast majority of human history. So, yes. But also it's important, just to say that in the spaces of empire, let's say, at least from my own experience, growing up in the US and living in Europe, it wasn't until quite recently that we could even say the word capitalism in public without people kind of like, whoa, And I think there's a need that we talk about this, and there's a need for a public education about what capitalism is. It's striking that we go to school, higher education, and no one really knows, no one ever gets a class in like, what is capitalism, right? That's kind of bizarre.
Thank you for the talk. I really appreciate the framing of the urbe documentation still being mentioned. I was wondering, how does that framing of what we do as architects could, I guess, make us rethink what design is today, and also form. I think we're basically talking about form, right? Like when we're seeing the urban in the maps, and also why I think that like the form is also in a way in your framing the documentation of like the social science, or I forgot the terms that you were using.
The urban geography and social,
right, and
sociological.
And I feel like when we talk about design, when we talk about form today, it's often about design, and then how this idea of documentation can help us understand design in a different way.
So how do you mean when you say form? Maybe, I don't want to hold you on that, maybe you didn't mean that, but...
I was thinking back towards Elisa's seminar where we kind of looked into the current form and I really like shared that like with your lecture as in it was also kind of like going through a documentation process of how kind of prices come around. So that was the connection. That's
really helpful. Yeah, no, I think if I can interpret the way Elisa is using the term form, it's how I would think of a kind of larger like logic of maybe even something at an epistemological level that sort of forms the background of what we take to be normal and natural. I think that's what I'm really trying to get at, is a sort of larger epistemological framework in which certain things start to take shape and reproduce themselves and become a sort of normative way of organizing the world, right? And I think that's, in a way, what Elisa has in mind with the idea of carbon form. The other part of your question, design, right? Thank you. I think there's no like program for design like that we can say, all right, this is the way we need to design from now on. I think it's that we have to understand the design world's alliances, connections, allegiances, entanglements with spaces outside of our forms of expertise, right? We're generally working within the world of real estate. We're generally working, with forms of power and so on and so forth. And I think these are all well known, but I think it's about understanding what it means to contribute to that and trying to, this is a really good question. I don't think I have an answer, but it's definitely on our mind at Bard College where I teach. We're really trying to think about ways of designing with communities, ways of thinking about how architecture historically has created and reproduced certain subjectivities and like individuating people and consecrating something like the nuclear family and so on and so forth. Like architecture has done that in space and through design. And so we can do very different things. But I think to get there, it's really a matter of seeing architecture in relation to the larger ecology of human life outside of it. Like, what about money? What about governance? How do these things work into how we understand design and so forth? So it's not an easy answer, but it's actually a really difficult challenge that we have to face, I think.
Thank you for the talk. I'm glad you started talking about Bard because my question is about how you are trying to bring some of these problems that you mentioned earlier about like how do we talk about what capitalism is in architecture school without necessarily like knowing what we share in terms of having thought about the social sciences or history or economics outside of the space of design school, and whether at Bard you are looking to other departments to to cover some of that material, or whether you are instead trying to teach it through architectural tools, architectural readings, and just what difficulties or like exciting things are happening to navigate that bizarre space.
Yeah, thank you. It's a bit of both in terms of like how we try to teach architecture and design in the context of Bard. We are definitely opening and collaborating, which is just the kind of culture at Bard in the first place. So it wasn't anything we invented, but so there's a real interdisciplinary kind of capacity of the school, which is great. But we're also trying to approach the question of architecture, in the luxury of space that we have in a liberal arts college where we don't have the professional requirements. We can sort of frame it the way we like, and I think all of us are in our own ways and collectively trying to constantly situate architecture differently from how it normally is. That's a really generic answer, I realize. But to go into details, I mean, we have sort of three basic frameworks that we're using to think about the teaching of design. So there's a kind of question of a planetary space. There's working with constituencies, like building, the new kinds of space with different activist groups and so on. And then very much one that's thinking about collective futures, like what would a future that is not so finely parsed out in individuated terms start to look like, and how can we start to focus a design practice around that? So these are all still very much works in progress. But I appreciate very much the question. It's become a big part of my own work, obviously, as being part of this small project at Bard. So.
Thank you so much for this fantastic talk. As an anthropologist, I'm just delighted that these conversations are happening in architecture school.
Thank you.
My question is not on the profession of architecture so much. It's a little more theoretical. It's a tricky question, but I invite your thoughts on this, which is, in conceptualizing the urban as essentially an outcome of settler colonialism, how does that risk discounting or diminishing other forms of urbanization and urbanisms in other parts of the world, indeed even in parts of Europe, as a previous question spoke about serfdom in medieval Europe and coming down to that. So the question then becomes, looking at these long city histories, if you like, but not recognizing them as urban, is there a reproduction of colonial disavowal of non-Western, collective forms of people?
That's a really great question. And it's something that I honestly still need to work into this project. Because inevitably I'm making a generalization. But somehow I feel it's funny to see how urban geographers especially make generalizations and then immediately walk them back and apologize for them. There's got to be some way that we can speak about certain conditions and certain, let's say, logics that are somehow applied or taken up and translated and so on in ways that we can see its effect as somehow general, even though it's always going to be different and always going to reflect various differences around the world. But I think your question is something that I don't think I've totally grappled with yet myself, but it's very much on my mind. Somehow I feel there needs to be room to speak about questions that somehow feel, or categories that somehow feel generalized in a sense, while at the same time wanting very much not to overstate that and reproduce a different coloniality at a kind of discursive level. So I'm working. Maybe we can have a drink after, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that.